think I'll get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and good morning if you are in the US, good evening if you are in India or in Europe. I would like to thank all our panelists for joining us as well. I will start with a welcome message written by Professor Sunil Amrit, who is the chair of South Asia Council. He would like to welcome. He could not be here due to some prior commitments, but he has sent a message for all of us, and I'm going to read it out. On behalf of the South Asia Council at Yale, I would like to welcome you all this morning's panel discussion on Dalit art and writing on a global stage. First and foremost, he is thanking me for this initiative. He's very sorry that he's not able to join us all this morning due to prior obligations that he had committed to before the date for this meeting was set, but he's delighted that so many of you from around the world have gathered here. The Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies is Yale University's focal point for promoting teaching and research on the culture, society, and politics of societies around the world. Housed within the Macmillan Center, the South Asia Council seeks to nourish the study of South Asia in a way that spans disciplines, regions, languages, and time periods. Among the Council's key goal is to foster scholarship that highlight the enduring inequalities and exclusions that characterize South Asia today at the intersection of caste, class, gender, and sexuality. As such, today's event is the vital highlight of our calendar this semester, highlighting as it does the crucial questions of ownership, inspiration, plagiarism, female creativity, and artistic ethicality with respect to Dalit art. And he's wishing us a generative and inspiring day of discussions, and would like to thank the panelists once again. With this, just some housekeeping rules and how the format of today's panel is going to be. We will I will do the introductions, and then we will have one panelist speaking after the other, and that will go on for about an hour. And then we have some presentations by Dalit artists from India. And then there will be in the end will be a Q&A round which will also have a discussion session with some prior moderated questions, and we will also open the floor for the questions, audience questions. So please, if you have any questions, do mention them in the chat box. So I'll start with the introduction. What made this whole panel possible? It is one of the curious and sociological under-theorized aspect of history and sociology of literature. It is a unique situation where women are not present only as pioneers. We are meeting here in the immediate context against the Dalit women writer Yashika Dutt, but we need not limit our discussion to this issue. The very backdrop of our panel is hopefully an occasion for leaving it behind and refocus on the content of the book beyond the context of our panel. So it is to provide an interface of some of the most fertile working minds on the Anglophone cultural theory from veteran stalwarts such as Appadurai to stars like Merve Emre and Martin Puchner, not to speak of the greatest prose stylist I know of the unclassifiable William Deresiewicz. My fellow Munich resident who could not be here with us today, Dr. Medenzana is a fascinating anthropologist and writer, and then Dr. Shalini Randeria, who could not join us today because of her health issues, the model woman of academia, an excitingly inspiring embodiment of what we rather duly call women's movement in India, for whom leadership comes very naturally, who could not join us here, and that's a very sad thing. And all of them inspire many of us who gathered here in the most unprecedented and shocking Dalit on Dalit persecution. Let us not pretend to not see alone in participating in constructing any lie. It is Dalit men, sadly of my own caste, the Mahar men, incidentally, who started it before Bollywood, the mafia of India, who created this hate campaign and digital lynching against this fierce Dalit writer sitting amongst us. With this brief introduction, I would like to start with Dr. William Deresiewicz. and I'll start with his introduction. I'm sorry, I have to read a lot over here, but please bear with me. William Deresiewicz is an award-winning American essayist and literary critic. Before leaving academia to become a full-time writer, he taught at this institution, the very institution, Yale University, for a decade. He has authored multiple books and written multiple essays, some of which have created tremors in the highest towers of American academia. In his piece titled Solitude and Leadership, written in 2012, originally delivered to the freshman class at the United States Military Academy at West Point, went viral for its frank exposition of pitfalls of elite education. His 2022 piece, Why I Left Academia, since you're wondering, laid bare the deeply worrying situation of humanities education in Ivy League universities and their self-perpetuating cycle of careerism and its ideological modes. Dr. Deresiewicz may be amused to know, but every text of his, my friends and I have read or reread, many of us made us fall in the awe of his work. One cannot help but connect the title of his book, The Death of the Artist, although about the plight of artists elsewhere, to this panel. His book, Excellent Sheep, reveals the mechanization of elite Ivy Leagues producing graduates who end up looking for lucrative jobs. For Deresiewicz, the fundamental role of literature and art in education is to enthuse and inspire young minds to think for themselves, a seemingly simple yet weighty appeal in an era where cynicism and the search for meaning have found countless avenues for dissipation. His advocacy for a more rounded and introspective approach to education that fosters intellectual curiosity, empathy, and a deeper understanding of oneself and the world. Interestingly, us, the untouchables in India, instill this core value of empathy due to our degraded birth and socialization. It remains with us when we live and work among our people, but as we move higher up on the social ladder, we tend to lose, even forgetting these values completely. The work of the likes of Deresiewicz shows us our true nature, our failure, our departure from what we stood for, and what we should stand for. And with this introduction, I would like to welcome Dr. Deresiewicz to give his speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm here with a sense of great humility, which has only been magnified by that very generous introduction. And humility because, as I insisted to Rupali when she invited me, I really know almost nothing about the Dalit community and its social and cultural situation. So I feel that I'm coming to this with a great deal of ignorance. And I hope that what I have to say today will be useful. But what I have to say today actually starts from my reflection on that ignorance. When I started to think about what I wanted to say today, I was thinking about the fact that my ignorance, largely of the Dalit situation, is not atypical of people in the West, including people who are well-educated and well-informed. Dalits constitute an enormous community. If you were a separate country, you would be one of the 6 or 8 largest in the world. You're subject to a form of group oppression that's one of the oldest in the world. And yet we know almost nothing about you here in the West. And so I started to think about why. And as I say, what I'm about to say may be fairly obvious, but first, we don't have the category of caste in the West. It doesn't align with any of our axes of oppression, race and religion and so forth. So we can't really make sense of caste oppression. Second, the image that the Indian state has long sought to project to the globe, the world's largest democracy, necessitates the fiction that the caste system has been relegated to the past. Perhaps this is even more the case with the recrudescence of Hindu nationalism under the BJP successive governments. But third, and I think most salient for this occasion, the Indian cultural elite, both in India and especially abroad, is of course drawn overwhelmingly from the upper castes, which means that like the Indian state itself, it is strongly invested in concealing the reality of the caste system. Its members, certainly not all of them, but I think probably fair to say a preponderance of them, don't want to talk about their own caste privilege. Still less, in many cases, their lingering caste prejudice. It's their dirty little secret. And I would say this is even more true now in the age of identity politics, when upper caste Indians in places like the United States are able and often eager to claim status as non-white, as an oppressed class, as non-white. In the inverted economy of social capital in today's elite Western spaces, upper caste Indians are able to pass from victimizer to victim. The very simple point is that if Dalits want their experience represented, especially on a global stage, they need to do it themselves. I'm a Jew. I'm a member of a group that was also persecuted and excluded for 2,000 years. So I think about what happened in the literary sphere when Jews began at last to be admitted into Western society in the 19th century. First, anti-Semitism, we can think about Oliver Twist. Then, or also soon, its opposite, idealization, the image of the saintly victim, like in Our Mutual Friend, which was sort of Dickens' apology, partly for Oliver Twist, or George Eliot's Daniel Deronda. This was better than anti-Semitism, but it was still not good. Finally, in the 20th century, really in a substantial way, not till after World War II, Jewish writers finally speaking about being Jewish for themselves. People like Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, Cynthia Ozick, Grace Paley. This, of course, is what needs to happen. The subaltern must speak. Nobody can do it for them, and anyone who claims to must be viewed with great suspicion. But note that I said that the Jewish writers who emerged after the war were speaking for themselves. They were not speaking for the group. They were not speaking for the Jews as a whole. In fact, and the case of Philip Roth is exemplary and probably familiar to many of you, they were often attacked by the group, or rather, an important distinction, by the leaders of the group. I literally remember our rabbi sermonizing against Philip Roth repeatedly in synagogue on Saturday. He was supposedly bringing shame to the community. Why was he doing that? Because he was telling uncomfortable truths, and not only telling them, but telling them in public where the others could hear them. But this is what artists do. As the matter was expressed by Harold Rosenberg, another celebrated post-war Jewish writer, the genuine work of art takes away from its audience its sense of knowing where it stands in relation to what has happened to it. Takes away, in other words, the accepted versions of history, the official accounts of identity. I mean from within the group, not the ones that people impose on the group, but even the ones from within the group. Rosenberg goes on, the genuine work of art suggests to the audience that its situation might be quite different than it had suspected. Now, this is the difference, to speak very broadly, this is the difference between the role of artists in traditional societies, where their function is to express and affirm collective beliefs, and the role of the artist in the modern world, where their function is to challenge them. And that difference, that transition, is always a fraught one, especially for historically oppressed communities. That's the tension that Rupali was talking about in the concept note she circulated for this event, the tension between collectivity and individuality. So who owns a work of art? Now, obviously, that's both a financial question and a moral one. And my answer in both respects, perhaps it's too simplistic an answer, my answer is the same. The person who made it owns it. No doubt, precisely because I grew up in a tight-knit religious community, I am intensely skeptical of the claims of the group, especially because they're never really those of the group, because the group as such cannot speak. They are always those of its self-appointed spokesman, and I use the gendered language intentionally, given the situation we're here to talk about today. The claim is always, from the spokesman to the artist, you are speaking for our common experience, and therefore we have the right to superintend your expression. But, as Rosenberg put it, there are common situations, but there are no common experiences. Every person's is their own. So, it's a double-edged sword, this business of traditional communities, especially marginalized ones, coming to a new kind of consciousness and a new global visibility through their artists and writers. Among other things, by connecting their members, especially their younger members, to a wider culture, artists and writers create avenues out of the community itself. They weaken the bonds of the community by raising and often modeling the possibility of new connections, new affiliations, new identities. This is basically what happened to me and my avenue out of my traditional community. And the self-appointed spokesmen know this, and this is part of what they fear and hate. So that means artists need support from the most courageous members of their community, but also from beyond their community. This is something that outsiders can do. And one form that support can take is economic. Rupali's concept note also spoke about the contradictory effect that capitalism can have in creating possibilities for acknowledgement and legal redress. But, and here I have to differ, it's not a contradiction at all. The transition that I talked about before, from tradition to modernity in art, from artists functioning as the mouthpieces of power to artists speaking truth to power, was only possible because of capitalism. It was precisely when writers and artists became able to sell their work as commodities in the marketplace that they were freed from financial dependence on, and therefore subservience to, church and crown, clergy and aristocracy. And in fact, legal regimes like copyright law, especially copyright law, were instrumental in effecting this change. We must not demonize the market. Yes, the market can be corrupting, but so can the alternative. I mean the nonprofit world, including academia, which is, as often as not, a realm of back-scratching, insiderism, petty territoriality, and unearned authority dishonestly exercised. Talent isn't necessarily rewarded any more than it is in the market. Instead of trying to entice the masses, the artist must seek to please the boards, the councils, the committees, who often overlap with the spokesman. Besides, when artistic disciplines are shielded from judgments of popular taste, they tend to turn inward, encasing themselves in theory and jargon. And you can think, for example, about the art of the art school or the orchestral music of these last many decades. The problem is not the market per se. The problem is what has happened to the market for creative productions in the age of the internet. Art has turned into what we call content. And content comes with a very different set of norms than art. Content is expected to be free or the closest thing to free. It is expected to be instantly available. Most importantly, while art is always inextricably connected to an artist, it is the tendency of content to be severed from its maker. You put on Spotify, one song follows another, you don't know who's creating them, or you don't care, or you don't remember a week later. And the same thing with your Netflix queue or your TikTok feed. Images and language float around, unmoored, uncredited, uncompensated. And that's exactly the way the tech companies want it. They make money from the traffic, and they don't want to send any of it back to the creator. If artists are dying, metaphorically, it's because they can't make a living. And they can't make a living to a great extent because their presence is suppressed. Artists, in a sense, are also a marginalized group. They also need to assert their visibility. They need to say, we're still here, give us what we're entitled to. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Deresiewicz. We have several important points, and we look forward to coming back to them in the discussion round. Now I'll go with Professor Appadurai. Professor Arjun Appadurai is a renowned Indian-American social anthropologist. He is currently Godard Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University and has held numerous prestigious positions in institutions in the US and Europe. He has worked extensively on the vagaries of globalization, beginning with his seminal essay, Disjuncture and Difference in the Global Cultural Economy in his late 80s. He thereafter went on to publish several articles, chapters, and notable books on the phenomenon, building a formidable body of work in globalization studies over the last 4 decades. Some of his notable books are Modernity at Large, Fear of Small Numbers, The Future as Cultural Facts, Essays on Global Condition, and most recently, Failure. Is co-authored with Nate Alexander. He has also served on several scholarly and advisory boards in the United States, Latin America, Europe, and India. Appadurai's work on globalization disrupted then prevailing frameworks such as world systems and dependency theory. His work emphasized the out-of-joint and conflictual nature of the global economy and made forays into relatively uncharted territories of elucidating the contradictory relations between economy, culture, and politics from a South Asian perspective. This introduced some much needed nuance in understanding globalization as not simply an imperial force, but as one that has multitude of effects on local power holders and nationalisms on the one hand, while unleashing unanticipated group novelizations and their concomitant aspirations and social imaginations. Professor Appadurai has paved the way for a more cultural understanding of how enlightenment, notions of freedom, equality, and liberty transforms in differing contexts across the world, resulting in both unforeseen creative forces and regressive pushbacks from the local ruling elite. He has also time and again in his prolific commentary as a public intellectual been a vocal supporter of Dalit politics as a key leftist force that must be reckoned with. As a long time admiring observers of your work and intellectual moves, we thought that it would not be too much to make a special appeal to him. Virtually, there is no conceivable topic that he has not touched upon, but his name sadly is not directly mentioned or discussed when it comes to Dalit discourses or the Dalit studies within the field of Dalit studies. It is high time. We are emboldened to request his greater participation and challenging insights for the sociology of Dalit literary and cultural studies in global times. With a big figure like him taking charge as a pioneer of this field, any cheap ownership of the hate groups do not stand a chance of qualifying as a hindrance. And people will think 1,000 times before attacking a Dalit writer and not coming in support when the Dalit writer is being attacked. To put it directly, Dalit studies needs its inspection and intervention and unsentimental criticism. And I use this occasion to appeal him to spearhead new thinking and create a new welcoming environment for Dalit letters in English to flourish at global centers. We genuinely believe that through his wisdom, experience, and ever-penetrating eye, not the least his provocations and interrogations, only could take such a project where it should lead. With this introduction, I welcome Professor Appadurai to give a speech. Professor Appadurai, you are on mute. Sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Yes. So sorry. Thanks very much for this far too generous introduction. But at my age, I'll take what I can get. So thank you very much. Even more, thank you for inviting me to this conversation involving people whose work I know and admire, and a couple of people who are absent, whose work I also greatly admire, but I'm sure we will hear from them in due course. And before I read my more or less prepared remarks, I think it's important to say I am a 74-year-old Tamil Brahmin by birth. We're all various things by birth. That's what I am by birth. Not about. It's not my vision or mission about myself, but it's indeed my birth. And generation where we were not actually exposed to Dalit studies as such. It's a shocking thing to say, but I can tell you year by year when Dalit studies arrived on the horizon through Ambedkar studies, then more generally Dalit. That's a story in itself, but it's a story that's in my middle age, which is a scandalous thing to report. And we can learn a lot from it because I was exposed to all kinds of libraries and education, and even to thinking in Indian languages, Tamil and Marathi, Hindi, and so on. But this Dalit studies as a field was just really almost absent. So today, you could say by a comparative measure, it's much more present, but relative, that's only relative to its zero presence 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So that's just a statement of context. And to also say that, therefore, I have to honestly say, although I've been studying India for a very long time, so I can't say I have not heard of this subject, it is a late arrival in my academic career, and it is only now in very recent years that I begin to see some of the things that uh, troubled me about India for deeply connected to what I was beginning to see was the Dalit experience. So the general point I want to make here before I go into my specific comments about today's topic is that I think apart from everything else, I'm convinced that the study of the Dalit experience, whether through literature or social science or history, actually could be a great unlocker of the 5 or 10 top questions about Indian society and history. And I never fail to remind people that that is a population of 1.3 billion. It's 1/6 of the world, roughly. So it is not a case study. It's a study of a very large chunk of humanity with many, many puzzles and questions and struggles. And I now see that it is not a matter of making room for Dalit studies or bringing it on board in the spirit of inclusion. It's a key to dominance, touch, physics of sociality, etc., which we have not had and will never have without it. So, in addition to the many political and other reasons, social, ethical, having to do with justice, fairness, equity, there is a very narrow reason. If you're an academic with 25 top questions about Indian history and society, you will fail in 24 of them if you don't have a deep understanding of this particular experience. So I start here. Now, let me go to my written comments, triggered by Rupali's excellent concept note, which I know she has produced in dialogue with other people, some of whom I'm fortunate to know, and centered on the experience of Yashika Dutt, who I'm very happy to acquaint myself with face to face today. So my title for my little comments today is Divide and Fool. So the most unfortunate part, in my view, of the recent attacks on Yashika Dutt is their use of the tactics of divide and fool. The recent attacks remind me of the Roman royalty who used to stage battles between slave gladiators to feed their bloodlust and demonstrate their lack of care for the lives of their slaves. Such divide and fool tactics have always been favored by ruling elites throughout history. And in the 20th century, the British showed how to turn divide and fool into divide and rule in India, Palestine, Ireland, and many other places. Today, ruling and fooling are totally dominated by media, both social and corporate, which have lost all interest in truth, facts, or evidence. The evidence that Ms. Dutt was commodified for a price of zero in the market, and I very much appreciate Bill's comments about the market. It's real, it's important, it's vital. So the price here was zero. That she was indeed the evidence that Ms. Dutt was commodified for zero market price, the evidence that she was indeed the author and creator of a powerful narrative modality for Dalit women particularly, and that she deserved both credit and compensation is overwhelming. But people who live in the orbit of the Indian film industry, of OTT and streaming, and who hunt for stories which scavenge from real lives, know that their accountability is minimal. You can do that. In the case of the experience of Dalits in India, claiming one's life, one's voice, and one's ownership of one's story are especially fraught, because the key is that Dalits were always seen as a form of property for the use of others, rather than as persons capable of owning property, whether physical property or intellectual property. How can you claim copyright when you barely have the right to visibility and voice? In India, it's a kind of question that makes me wonder, how long it will take and what it will take, given this reality. That is, you are yourself property. What do you mean this is your property? It's a nonsensical question in the Indian context, amazingly. In the present situation in India, even more troubling, divide and rule as a principle is being used against Dalits, with privileged upper caste figures claiming the right to decide who are good Dalits and who are bad. And we know in this debate that that line has been clearly drawn. Dalits. And the people who decide this are not an atypical situation, but it is reprehensible. And this poisonous claim, in other words, to decide who are good Dalits and who are bad Dalits, just like with good Muslims and bad Muslims, as my friend Mahmood Maknani has said, must be exposed, contested, and debated. Finally, theft, plagiarism, and profiteering have a long history in the arts and literature, both in India and everywhere else, surely in the West. But to make a claim about plagiarism in the public sphere takes money, courage, and social support. Yashika Dutt and her supporters certainly have the courage, but social support and money, I know, are scarcer than they should be. Hopefully, public debates like this one will change that situation so that the search for Dalit dignity can claim its rightful place in the courts, in the arts, and in the marketplace. A footnote now I want to add before I finish. I began with a personal statement about belonging to the highest caste. My father's own story, which very few people know, is that because his father died in a tiny arid village in the deep south, he had to actually go and beg. But even in that, he would beg in the Agraharam. So, but beg he did. So this is not exactly the same background as many other people, or the image of what it means to be Brahmin. That image is itself a bit, has more complexities. Everybody's image in India has more complexities in stories. Still and all, since that is true, and I've always said to people like me, when I meet them, remember, you began a 100-meter race with a 99-meter advantage. So don't think you're God's gift because you're working for McKinsey or teaching at Harvard or this or that. You started with 1 meter left. So your competition is with all the people who started at 99. So think of the people who started 80, 60, 40, 20. So that is where the Dalit story comes. So I'm certainly part of that story, but I'm happy to say I do not see my achievements, successes as God's gift. I see them as, building on a huge accumulated set of advantages for my caste and for other nearby castes and privileged elites in India for millennia. I want to say one thing, which is the product of a very recent set of experiences within the last year or two, which also reminded me that one of the most toxic things going on in our world, and here I will flag the US, which is always ahead, both in the best things and in the worst things. It always comes first. It's the pioneer of the most monstrous things we know and some of the very good things that we know also. And that is the wholesale impunity with which speaking for Dalits is now co-opted by people who are super privileged in the South Asian diaspora. I'm going to today name no names, but I promise that that will not last forever. But I will tell you that in the name of various virtues that are currently ascendant, although the backlash has already begun, it is amazing. Since we're talking of Dalits and since we're talking of South Asia, I can be very pointed and say there is a certain highly privileged part of the South Asian academic diaspora. And I think Bill Deresiewicz will again recognize all the kind of diseases of the American university system that are there. It's not also in Europe, I have to say. It's not a pure American phenomenon, but Americans lead. The point is people whose only complaint is that they're not at the very top. So they're not yet at Harvard. They don't yet have the Nobel Prize. That's the complaint. These are the people who shamelessly use identification with non-Savarnas. Although all of them, without exception, are upper caste, almost all of them more privileged than I. So I have been the target myself, and I don't want to claim any identity with the profound humiliation of Dalits in India forever. But I do want to say that I have a special place in my critique for those people who, instead of celebrating their privilege, sharing it, accommodating it, and admitting it, will in fact speak as if they are victims just the way people at the bottom of the caste pyramid are. That is another scandal, and I think that scandal is not unconnected to the current hysteria that has been generated around Yashika. But to connect those dots would be a whole story in itself. I just leave it for now. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Appadurai, for that powerful message and some powerful words, and then the commitments for future as well. I'll now move on to our third speaker of the day, Professor Martin Puchner. Professor Martin Puchner is a literary critic, academic, philosopher, and institution builder. He has held the H. Gordon Garbidian Chair at Columbia University and now holds the Byron and Anita Wien Chair of Drama and of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University, where he's also the founding director of the Mellon School of Theatre and Performance Research. He is also the awardee of prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship, the Berlin Prize, the Humboldt Prize, and among others. As a literary scholar, he began his serious inquiry into modernism, theatre, drama, with such publications as Stage Fright, Modernism, Anti-Theatricality and Drama, and Against Theaters, which historicize a confrontation between avant-garde theater that preferred an aggressive theatricality, such as in Wagner, and other anti-theatrical generic impulses like lyric poetry and novel, and argue that such contradictions enriched the history of modern theater, literature, and poetry. After such interventions into the literary and genre criticism, Puchner tried his critical attention to all matters world literature. With the 6 volumes of Norton Anthology of World Literature, of which he was the general editor, and the Harvard X Mock Lectures on World Literature, he launched in 2016, he has been a vocal proponent of world literature. His work, such as The Written World, Literature for a Changing Planet, and a recent publication, Culture, The Story of Us, have reinvigorated the humanities departments, especially literary academia, with a sense of urgency towards rethinking the role of storytelling, writing, and literature in today's world marketed by unprecedented technological changes as well as climate changes. The Written World traces the history of the word from its invention in Mesopotamia to the internet age and the future libraries, situating the emergence of literature in the moment when storytelling interacted with new forms of writing, technologies such as invention of the alphabet, the paper, then print. What Puchner also attempts to do here is to trace a history of how written word was not merely a tool for representation of the world as it existed, but also what caused such a world to come about in the first place. With his 2 recent work on culture, his focus expands from the history of literature and the written word to a larger sense of culture as such. For him, culture is first and foremost a form of meaning making, an attempt at explaining the why of human existence, but more importantly, in direct confrontation with existence, direct confrontation with cultural conservatism that promotes cultural narrow-mindedness. He lays bare the sterility as well as historical incorrectness of the idea of pure culture. As for him, culture can only be located at the site of interaction, engagement, and encounter with other cultures. Our history is replete with these encounters, from between Alexander the Great and Ashoka to Goethe in his reading of translated Chinese literary work that led to his famous proclamation at the end of the era of national one-sidedness. Words are falling short for his introduction. He's also a German, and that's why I associate with him differently, because my partner is also German. And recently, I also read his book on Rothwelsch, where he discusses his own journey into finding the history of Rothwelsch, and I was quite fascinated by his history. I would like to, with a small introduction, I would like to invite Professor Puchner to deliver his speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rupali. And let me start by saying that you have done an incredible job putting together this panel, putting so much thought into it, and these unbelievable introductions you have given to us so far. I don't think I've ever seen an MC, an organizer, who has gone about it in such a thoughtful and generous and astute way. So it's really been an incredible experience. And like William, I want to also preface, say the obvious, namely that I'm a complete outsider here, learning about Dalit art, and it's been very moving in the context of this panel and a few other contexts, the Jaipur Literary Festival and a few other contexts, to learn a little bit about it. And it's really a wake-up call for me to educate myself more about it. So, and I see also that we're running a little bit short, so I'm going to try to summarize what I was going to say and not take the whole time. as a literary critic, so the whole panel was prompted, of course, by that episode in Made in Heaven. And as a literary critic, I can't, and cultural critic, I can't help but start with a few observations about that episode, a kind of reading of that episode, because I think it weirdly speaks to this panel and the whole aftermath. And apologies for those who haven't seen it. So this is in the second season of Made in Heaven, and it's a fascinatingly layered situation, because the episode, and it's, of course, it's one of these new streaming shows that try to get its politics right, and it, we can all feel good about it. And so it, at the center of this episode is a marriage, a cross-caste marriage. Everyone can feel good about it. The groom, who comes from is upper caste, he's fallen in love with this Dalit woman. They're about to get married. There are just a few details about the wedding ceremony to be worked out. Clearly, the parents of the groom, they may not be super happy about it, but they have agreed, obviously, to this marriage. So the marriage it's going to happen, and that's wonderful. Now, the message of the show over the course of that episode is that, well, things turn out to be more complicated. The few details about the wedding ceremony, as they do in all cultures, I think, bring up these larger, deeper cultural issues. It becomes clear that the groom's upper caste family is very critical, is very dismissive, and even the groom, in a fight between bride and groom, has to learn, and we, the audience, learns with him that this caste prejudice is much deeper. It's much more difficult to root out than just with a marriage. There is much more work to be done, and in the end, I think there is sort of a sense that watching this show has been this educational experience, because we have learned there isn't this easy solution. Oh, we'll just approve of this marriage. There is this deeper, cultural reckoning with a long time of cultural prejudice to be reckoned with. Okay, so this is what I take to be the politics and the thrust of this episode. And given that that's what it is, it's, depending on how you want to call it, ironic or telling that, in a way, the whole controversy about Yashika Dutt's personal property and using of her life story in that, and the backlash against the claiming of that property, in some sense, is a perfect illustration of the message of the show. Because and here I'm reading the show sort of allegorically, it says, what I take away from it is, it's not enough to make Netflix or Amazon Prime show about, well, caste prejudice is a little bit more deeply rooted than we maybe thought, because once it comes to ownership of property, then really things become much more complicated, and we see in the backlash against the show just how deeply and widespread and nefarious caste privilege is. So in some sense, the controversy proves the thesis of the show, but it's also then makes you so sad that the makers of this show don't get it. And I think that, and here maybe some of my remarks will resonate with Williams, it shows that when it comes to ownership over these productions, so we are very happy to put out these plots that that try to be sensitive to minorities and to sexual difference and so on and so forth. So Made in Heaven has its politics right. It's beautiful. It can feel very good about it. But when it comes to ownership of the means of production, of life story, and so on and so forth, then things become much more complicated. So that's my first observation, and it just seems like such an irony, but irony is not even the right word here, and I think it bears more analysis. That the message of the show, the plot of the show, and then the whole controversy around it are on so divergent paths from the perspective of the makers, or you could say they reinforce that show that, in fact, this is much more difficult. So this is the first thing I wanted to say that really struck me by, watching a couple of episodes of Made in Heaven, and in particular this show, and contrasting it with the controversy around it. The other thing I want to say, and I hope I'm going to get this right, is that in the last year or so, or especially since my last book, Culture, came out, that Rupali mentioned, I've had a lot of conversations about cultural ownership, especially around the term cultural appropriation. And I think that the case that we are discussing today may well be a limit case for my general thoughts about it. And it's making me think more about my general theses. So my general thesis is that the term cultural appropriation is overused today, because it is applied to a very large range of cases. It's supposed to avoid a couple of quite different bad outcomes. Among those are stupid, uninformed, crassly ignorant uses of other cultures, and we can all think of a million examples of that. So cultural appropriation is used to call out that. It's also used, and that's, I think, more the case we are discussing today, in sort of commercially exploitative, in crassly commercially exploitative uses of other cultures or other people's experiences. So cultural appropriation is sometimes used in that context. It's sometimes used in the context of the restitution debate about museums requiring the return of objects that were acquired or stolen, acquired under dubious circumstances. A lot of Western museums have to reckon with that and are just starting to acknowledge this huge problem. And then, and this is, again, so this is less relevant here, but the last one, and that's very relevant and resonates with what others have said so far, is intellectual property right and ownership for artists themselves, and how that is threatened today, and in what form, whether that's legal, probably not so much illegal, than having to do with ownership of streaming platforms and the content that William, I think, described very, very, very eloquently. So I think cultural appropriation is, though the problem is using cultural appropriation in all of these contexts, is that from a kind of deep view of culture, from a bird's eye perspective of culture, it's clear that culture is always composed of bits of other cultures, that cultures thrive and survive by borrowing and letting themselves be borrowed by others. And that's, for me, so that was, for me, from that kind of broad history of culture, the big takeaway point. But I recognize that there are important limit cases where maybe that general rule about, if you want to survive as a culture, you need outsiders to take an interest in it. You need outsiders in some sense to also feel that they want to use aspects of your culture, even though that does mean a loss of control. So that's, for me, the difficult conundrum or paradox, or something that I continue to grapple with. That because I take that to be a general rule, I do think that may also be the case with Dalit art, and especially at this moment where it is becoming a little bit more widely known, and where people want it to be more widely known. So how to navigate that loss of control, in some sense loss of ownership, and I'm not talking about individual copyright, but more a kind of group ownership. And because that's mostly in the context of this kind of group ownership that cultural appropriation is used. So this is just, I want to say that more as a question for you all, for the audience, and for myself. To what extent can we still, if it's true, and I'm convinced by it, but I'm also happy to get into an argument about it, that ultimately, if a culture wants to survive, you can't just hold it back. You can't just make it a matter of group ownership. You need to let it circulate in some sense. How can we create rules and mechanisms for good and fair circulation rather than the stupid ignorant or the crassly exploitative one. But how can we do that with a language that doesn't presume group ownership over art or over entire traditions? And how can we create an atmosphere in which Dalit art becomes something that outsiders like me can engage with and want to study? So that for me, and I know this is a very high level of abstraction, is this question of ownership of culture that is raised here, and that I've been grappling with, and that I thought that is maybe one reason why Rupali thought I might join this panel. So I have these two different thoughts here on offer. On the one hand, this observation about the ironies of this case made in Kevin in that episode, where the plot sort of gets its politics right, but the whole controversy around it shows that that's not enough, and maybe could be a prompt to discuss in general the limits of this, what we are all seeing on Netflix, on Amazon, these shows that are very, very enlightened and are very proud of being very enlightened, and the limits of that in the age of the streaming platforms. And on the other hand, that very abstract, admittedly very abstract question of cultural ownership and circulation of culture, and how that may play out in this particular case, which I know not enough about to really weigh in on, and would love to hear more about. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Puchner, for those brilliant questions. I think they will remain with us even beyond this conversation, and something that we will think along the way when we are imagining about Dalit literary and cultural production. Now I would like to invite, introduce Professor Merve Emre, who is sick, by the way, but I'm so thankful to her, a special thanks to her for joining us. She's having COVID right now, but I can't thank you enough for joining us today. Professor Merve Emre is a literary critic, academic, and a prolific reviewer whose essays and writings on culture, its historical and contemporary crises, trends, and multifaceted developments have featured in magazines such as New York Review of Books, Harper's, the New York Times magazines, London Review of Books, among others. She is currently the Safiro Silverberg Professor of Creative Writing and Criticism at Wesleyan University. Want to know what kind of a reader and writer you are, good or a bad one? Please go and check Vladimir Nabokov's list. Emre mentions on the very first page of her book, The Para-Literary, The Making of Bad Readers in Post-War America. In Emre's exploration, a good reader or a bad reader is less than the person of the reader, and more the kind of reading practices that consolidated in spaces outside official and high literature departments. Such reading practices include reading which is goal-oriented, morally lifting, and ethically charged, ultimately meant to influence America's national adversaries. Emre sees these paraliterary reading practices unfolding outside universities, such as simple novels, how-to manuals, bureaucratic documents, as a cultural extension of the political dominance that post-war America sought to exert. These politically motivated reading practices also reflect in contemporary debates in cultural studies, which can now be read as a discipline that promotes bad reading practices, such as surface reading, as against a reading that favors questions of aesthetic and literary form. If you are a fan of the famous Italian quartet Byron and Ferrante, I am, then you can't miss Hervé's co-authored book, The Ferrante Letters, which from the reviews we read of the books, 4 critiques to share their personal and critical reflection, and builds a new way of reading, thinking, and writing together, and gives shapes to this new method called collective criticism. Other than writing acclaimed books, Emre has also penned several book reviews in New York, Book Reviews, the place when one can find the longest illustrious stories, but the book review also comes with the same length. The question of bad reading and bad writing practice across Dalit writing today, and as Dalit letters in English continues to place reliance on two dominant literary forms, autobiography / memoir and poetry. Unlike many of its counterparts in the post-colonial world and other marginalized literatures, such as African American literature, African literature, Australian literature, among others, there is a peculiar near total quantitative, qualitative absence of the great modern form, the novel. One is forced to ask why this is so. As Emre wants in a different context, in Dalit letters in English, there is a continued favoring of the overtly political reading and writing at the cost of literary, something that was visible in the reception of Dalit author Yashika Dutt's memoir as well. With this small introduction, I would like to invite Professor Emre to start her speech. Thank you.
I've learned so much from your introductory remarks today. Thank you for all the work you've done organizing this. I apologize for being a little bit sniffly and a little bit under the weather. I thought COVID was done. I thought we'd all agreed that it was over, but it turns out not so much. Yashika, I know your work from the Jaipur Literary Festival circuit in the US, and I admire it greatly. And I will confess that I did not know about what you have endured until I received Rupali's email and fell down the various internet rabbit holes that let me get a full understanding of the campaign against you. And as I was reading your book, I was thinking how strange and how terrible it must be that at the very moment when you had the courage to claim your identity and to speak on behalf of other people who might share it, that identity then would be subject to the kind of harassment and abuse that I have seen you have to endure. And I think many people believe that public visibility comes with invincibility, and they don't often realize that it also comes with a tremendous, tremendous amount of vulnerability. And so I'm incredibly sorry for what you've had to go through. And thank you for, it's also an act of bravery to allow it to be the occasion for us convening today. So thank you for that. And as I was going down those various rabbit holes and getting angrier and angrier on your behalf, I did what I always do when I get angry, which is try to find some kind of abstracted framework in which that anger can be made more productive or in which you can make sense of it. And I don't know if that's an academic tick or if it's a gendered tick. Sometimes I wonder. But it led me to 6 questions that I have for you and for the panel and for the audience. I know that you are speaking after I finish speaking, and so I thought perhaps these 6 questions might be questions that would help us better understand what it is that you've been going through, what it is that is politically and aesthetically at stake for all of us in questions about representation of either Dalit identity or more other marginalized identities, what is at stake in some of the conversations about the market and capital that we've been having along the way. So here are the 6 questions that came to mind as I researched the situation and also as I've heard my co-panelists speak. The first question that comes to mind is, what is the shape of the Dalit passing narrative? Rupali very helpfully gestured to African-American literature and to Australian Indigenous literature, both of which have their own versions of the passing narrative. And Yashika, as I was reading interviews with you, I was so struck by your insistence that one of the reasons it was particularly hard to come out was because I don't look like a Dalit. And so it made me think about what the tropes or the motifs or the signs of the Dalit passing narrative are. Are they primarily visual? Are they linguistic? Is it mostly about a practice of silence, of not admitting to what you are? And how is it that certain externalized behaviors that are undertaken in the name of self-preservation then become interior states of mind? I think what your book does so brilliantly is show the connection between those externalized behaviors and that interior state of mind that you excavate in the process of writing. And I was hoping that we could talk a little bit more about how the memoir in particular becomes the form that receives the passing narrative, that holds it and that circulates it. The second question, who owns a coming out story? This has been the question on which so much of the controversy around your memoir, around the streaming series has circulated. What part of a coming out story can be owned? Is it the phrase coming out? Is it the particular narrative and the characters that appear in it, or the events that structure it? Is it the affects that attend to it? Is ownership in this case, ownership in terms of copyright? Is it a legal right, as a number of our panelists have suggested? Or is it a moral right? If it's a legal right, then there are certain avenues for redress. But if it's a moral right, there's a more complicated question or series of questions that comes up around ownership and how, if ever, it can be adjudicated. And this is what I take Martin to be saying when he talks about how this case might actually take us to the limits of how we tend to think about cultural appropriation. My third question, what is the difference between coming out as gay or queer and coming out as belonging to a particular caste or a particular class? The way that you describe gender discrimination, violence toward women and queer people, and violence toward members of the caste all make me think that this is also a kind of limit case, or perhaps not a limit case, but an exemplary case for thinking about intersectionality, another word that I think is massively overused today in questions about the relationship between politics and aesthetics, but which the controversy around your book and its appropriation allows us to really dig into. I was thinking in reading your interviews about what the relationship might be between gay pride and Dalit pride, and to connect this back to the question of the passing narrative. If the passing narrative has certain kind of externalized markers, if it requires people to look or to speak a certain way or to not speak at all, then what does the coming out narrative require? And what does pride mean in this situation? Fourth, how does a coming out story and the question of who gets to represent it get remediated as we move across different forms and platforms? I was really taken by your Tumblr, Documents of Dalit Discrimination. And I was thinking about how that is such an incredible archive and ground on which you base your journalism, and then how the journalism becomes the ground on which you base your memoir, and how a streaming series takes what it finds in a Tumblr, a work of journalism, or a memoir, and tries to shape it for a really different set of audiences. So how do those practices of remediation work as we move across these different forms? How have you thought about it as you have moved across different platforms? And how do we think that this controversy is in part a controversy of remediation, of the fact that certain things get set in certain forms and then repeated and altered in that process of repetition in other forms? Fifth, what happens when stories of marginalized peoples become corporatized? What happens when representation is subject to a global profit motive, since that is, of course, that is probably really the heart of the story that we are telling here. The incentives of a streaming network or a streaming series are vastly different from the incentives that you had when you started your Tumblr or when you wrote your memoir. And what we are seeing is, in part, and again, not to abstract from the experience itself, but in part a story about two different sets of incentives with two different feelings of responsibility toward representation, toward circulation and distribution, coming into contact with one another. And sixth, and finally, what can we do for you? Not just what can we do for you, Yashika, because I think everyone here is here precisely because they want to support you in whatever way they can, but also what can we do for, hold on, this is testing my math skills, 107 minus how many are we? 5, 6, 7 people. What can we do for the 100 other people who are listening to this panel and who are presumably listening because they have some of the same worries and anxieties and some of the same political commitments that you do, and some of the same aesthetic commitments that you do. And so I thought perhaps the best way to make the transition from those of us on the panel to your response would be to start with that question, what can we do for you? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Emre, for that really strong note and message. So I will now introduce Yashika, our last speaker. So, while efforts have been made to make her name and work infamous, such efforts have only made her sparkle like a star. Yashika Dutt is one of the handful of Dalit authors writing in English, which is why her contribution will always remain marked in golden words in Dalit literary history. There are only a few Dalit women writers in English, leaving some fingers on your single hand, if you count. Sociologically speaking, why there are no Dalit literary men writing in English, it is a very interesting question. There may be some pen envy at work here. We will see what we have heard what other panelists have said about it, and we will discuss more on it in the Q&A and discussion round. Unlike most other Dalits, Yashika could have also lived and worked by hiding her identity of being an untouchable, and kept on passing and fooling others as an upper caste person, even at Columbia Journalism School, and while she was working at the Journalist in New Delhi. In a word, all her life and professional life, until she heard of the student uprising at University of Hyderabad, which is a university in India, following the suicide of research scholar, Ambedkar Student Association leader, Dalit Marxist Rohit Vemula. However, what made her coming out as a Dalit an epic moment is coming out. Her coming out was public on a social media post in 2016, which she eventually wrote a full book published in 2019. It was a lodestar among the wide variety of creative responses, exploded in all Indian languages, including by mostly first-time authors, to the martyrdom of Rohit Vemula. Books are there for reading and reference, yet people easily forget such histories. There is a famous argument among Dalit men and Dalit feminists, always making about their voice remaining unheard. There is some truth to this argument. This happens because Dalit share a difficult relationship with words, and then with English, and upper caste do not let Dalit speak, except when we speak what upper caste want us to say. So understandably, Dalit should realize the importance of words and voice, especially written words. Yet alas, what unfolded with Yashika that reveals that English-speaking Dalits, that Dalits do not understand the value of their writers, even a very rare, pioneering, and a unique one like Yashika. So Yashika, the floor is all yours. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Rupali. I think I just want to echo everybody. You've been incredible. We've all been on a number of panels, but the energy and the care and the nuance that you've brought to this discussion is unmatched. I want to say thank you for elevating this moment that has been extremely difficult for me personally into a conversation that we can build on, not just for my own work, but for Dalit literary genres and art in general. So, and frankly, hearing all of you speak about tangentially about my work, but also addressing it directly, I sit here with chills, because from my journey from 2016 of coming out as Dalit with the book, I have always struggled to enter these spaces that are, as Professor Appadurai was saying, that are inhabited by dominant caste South Asians who gatekeep Dalit folks and Dalit writing from entering them. So the fact that all of you are here and using this moment to transcend into something so much more powerful and bigger than this issue is, for me, a really remarkable thing. And I really am truly honored to be in conversation with each and every one of you. So thank you. I'm really grateful to my Dalit siblings, Rupali Bansore, Cheshta Rajora, and along with Sukrita Lori and Abir Das that you mentioned earlier, that you have organized this powerful panel of thinkers and intellectuals. There is no doubt that Dalit culture today stands at a turn as our narratives, stories, and even lives go from being erased and ignored to becoming profit-generating models for a liberal cultural economy that hopes to distinguish itself from a right-wing apparatus in India by leaning on a discourse that until now it never bothered paying attention to. In less than a decade, Dalit ideas and stories have gone from being denied to getting prominently positioned in the South Asian narratives of cultural change and progress. As Dalit voices have gained power and visibility online and on international platforms, it has become increasingly difficult for even the most forceful obliterators of caste to deny its existence and power in the shaping of Indian culture as we know it. The recent global movement of Dalit populations, particularly into the United States, have helped generate a new and exciting currency around our stories. Yet, as Dalit stories enter newer relationships of profit-making, mainly for the same establishment that has always served its own interests by ignoring them thus far, Dalit people who generate them, often at a deeply personal, social, and psychological cost, are left far behind. In this latest episode of The Blatant Theft of My Likeness by a series on Amazon Prime, a Dalit author is depicted as an outspoken woman, seemingly in charge of her own destiny. For her in the show, all that is personal is also political. It's a glamorous story of a well-off Dalit character whose life couldn't be less picturesque than a fictional fantasy. Even as in real life, this Dalit female author, whose words, likeness, and personal life were so flagrantly robbed from, continues to struggle to maintain this work as a result of lack of support networks, resources, and familial wealth. The irony of a show attempting to locate itself in the realm of justice and representation, while not only failing to acknowledge its sources, but also violently discrediting the work of those it blithely took from. That irony would be unusual if it did not exhibit the current model of content creation that unfortunately all art and creativity seems to be trapped into at this moment. Excluded from institutions that are specifically designed to keep us out, Dalit artists and writers have relied extensively on digital and social mediums to circulate our art. It is no surprise that digital mediums are inextricably linked to the growth of our visibility and the power of our voices. Rohit Vemula, the Dalit scholar from Hyderabad University, was institutionally murdered when he was forced to take his own life as a result of the trauma and pushback from his calling out of the casteist practices in his institutions. He became a symbol of the new Dalit narrative, which directly led to this change that we are witnessing today. His last letter, which will forever be considered the single most important document of Dalit literature in English, was responsible for thousands of young Dalit people to reject the forced shame of their castes and find pride and courage in their identities, including myself. It circulated and disseminated online, away from the controlling narratives of establishment media channels, where countless Dalit people encountered the potent charge of their own history. This also partly explains why so many Dalit artists and writers use digital mediums to test and gain their voice, which expanded into an unparalleled force so formidable that it practically forced dominant caste-owned publishing houses in my case, and establishment art galleries in the cases of others to take us on so they could expand their own reach for relevance. The selective institutional beneficence, which is while it has expanded the reach and access for a select few of us, it has also meanwhile raised questions of representation and authenticity among others, many of them being dominant caste intellectuals and even some Dalit themselves who seek to position themselves as the arbiters of the perfect subaltern who must not speak. What does a perfect Dalit look like? One who is still dependent on the magnanimity of a dominant caste into being anointed with a voice. But once you do get that kind of voice and visibility that we must endlessly strive for, we immediately cease to be the kind of Dalit who deserves empathy, nuance, or care for the struggles that we have not only endured in the past, but continue to wrestle with, as we put ourselves in the precarious positions of creating art in this late-stage capitalist hellscape. Once I stood up directly to demand the credit I was clearly owed, not just from a dominant caste establishment, but also from a Dalit director with much larger reach, access, and resources than my own, I had immediately defied the one tenet that a certain vocal section of the Indian Dalit community seems devoted to. That tenet being the recognition of the individual from amongst a collective. The idea that 250 million plus people who are not only culturally, linguistically, genetically, geographically, and positionally diverse, but also have an inherent imbalance in the power dynamics of castes among themselves, the fact that they could be considered a monolith, this idea has been useful so far to create a collective identity against domineering forces of caste erasure and oppression. But as we rapidly transcend from the invisibility towards access, it is crucial to rethink some of these definitions that have been exploited to perpetuate the old systems of power that we claim to stand up against ourselves. Individual attribution becomes necessary for not just the recognition, but even the survival of Dalit artists and writers who exist in what our co-panelist William Deresiewicz describes as the era of producerism, where every content creator must be seen at all times to be considered valuable or worthy. It is equally important to consider the violent nature of the pushback I received from the lens of dominant caste practices of brutalizing Dalit women to teach the rest of the community a lesson in silence and subservience. There is no dearth of documentation around the violence of Dalit and indigenous women, often through sexual, verbal, and physical assault to avenge the hurt pride of a dominant caste community. Most recently, we witnessed this in the horrific mutilations of lower caste Kuki women in India's Manipur. While the dimensions of the violence that I experienced were starkly and mercifully different in my case, the gendered assault on my appearance, the quote-unquote high pitch of my voice, the desire for accountability of my own life's work, which was termed as toxicity, and the lack of apology and deference around my demand, which was reframed as narcissism, along with more obvious and relentless threats of assault, abuse, and online violence. These were completely in line with the casteist tradition of teaching a Dalit woman who defies her caste order a ruthless lesson. It was a warning shot fired against a Bhangi woman from a manual scavenging community who was among the lowest in the caste system by influential makers from $1 billion Hindi film industry, along with a handful of other Dalits from castes who were higher than my own. The shot said that our voices and visibility only deserve to go as far as we continue to generate new narratives that are deemed worthy of minting coins, while we remain invisible ourselves. And we must do this without challenging the authority of the establishment makers, even if they happen to be Dalit themselves, on whose largesse we must rely on for credibility. Who deserves to create? And who deserves to own and bask in the acknowledgement and accolades for that creation? Who is considered tamed enough to be co-opted by these establishments? and who gets chewed and spat out when they fall out of line? Where do they come from, and where do they fit in the larger conversations of Dalit art and culture? It is getting increasingly urgent that we find these answers to these questions and that we do it now. Thank you so much.
So we are back, and we have Malvika Raj, an artist from India, from Indian state of Bihar. She paints paintings in Madhubani art, and she has painted this beautiful painting of Yashika Dutt. And I would like her to say a few words about this painting and what she thinks about Dalit writers. And Niharika Rao will be helping us with the translations once Malvika is done.
Hello everyone, and thank you. रूपाली को स्पेशल थैंक्स कि इसने मुझे ये स्टेज दिया और ये मुझे अपने आर्ट के बारे में और क्या आर्टिस्ट और राइटर्स कितना इम्पोर्टेंस रखते हैं सोसाइटी में, वो मैं बताना, मैं क्या सोचती हूँ उसके बारे में। और मैं एक आर्टिस्ट हूँ, एक डिज़ाइनर हूँ, और मधुबनी आर्ट फॉर्म जो इंडिया का एंशिएंट आर्ट फॉर्म है, उसमें मैं पेंटिंग्स करती हूँ। और जो पेंटिंग्स आज तक लाइक सारे हिंदू माइथोलॉजी के ऊपर सारे पेंटिंग्स बनते थे मधुबनी आर्ट फॉर्म में, बट मैंने बुद्ध को अपनी पेंटिंग्स में दिखाया है। और स्पेशली जो हमारे महापुरुष हैं और हमारे जैसे बी आर बाबा साहब अम्बेडकर, सावित्रीबाई फुले और नांगेली, इन सब के इन्होंने जो हमारे समाज के लिए किया है, सो उनका जो स्ट्रगल है उसको मैं अपनी पेंटिंग के थ्रू दिखाती हूँ। और अभी जो इंडिया में जो एट्रोसिटीज होते हैं, लाइक हाथरस का केस हुआ, और भी जो बलात्कार के केसेस हैं और जितने एट्रोसिटीज हैं उसके ऊपर भी मैं पेंटिंग्स बनाती हूँ। सो और अब ये जो पेंटिंग मैं यशिका के ऊपर मैंने ये उनको जितना स्ट्रगल देखना पड़ा है, इतना नोन राइटर होने के बावजूद भी वो इस तरह का स्ट्रगल देख रही हैं और उनको ये सब फेस करना पड़ रहा है। सो ये पेंटिंग मैंने उस पे बनाया है। और एक और पेंटिंग जो बनाई है मैंने उनकी ग्रैंडमदर जो अभी प्रोसेस में है। सो मैं ये बताना चाहूंगी कि लाइक जो सेकंड पेंटिंग है, सो इसमें जो उनके जो हमारा जो दलित समाज है, उनकी ग्रैंडमदर ने जो एट्रोसिटी और जो अब्यूजेस सहे हैं, वो अभी के टाइम में वो फेस चेंज हो गया है, बट वो जो डिस्क्रिमिनेशन है वो अभी भी फेस चेंज होने के बावजूद भी अभी भी वो है। सो वो यशिका जो अभी फेस कर रही है, सो उसको मैंने इसमें दिखाने की कोशिश की। सो या मैं ज्यादा नहीं बोलूंगी, मैं आर्टिस्ट हूँ, सो मेरा काम आर्ट वर्क का है, और बस ये मैं यशिका का स्ट्रगल मैं दिखाना चाह रही थी।
Thank you so much, Malvika. Niharika, would you like to translate what Malvika just said?
Yes. Malvika has thanked Rupali and the panelists for giving her the stage amongst all the greats, all the intellectuals, all the other artists. Malvika is an artist. She's the designer. And for today's panel, she's chosen Madhubani art form. Madhubani art form is an ancient Indian art form. And it is an art form that is majorly used to depict Hindu mythologies and stories of Hindu mythology and the greats of Hindu mythology. But Malvika, as an attempt to change the narrative, has chosen the art form that is usually used to depict Hindu mythologies, to depict the pioneers of Indian sociology and Indian the Indian greats of Ambedkar and Phule. That's she's pointed to why she's chosen Madhubani art as her art form, and especially for today's panel. And she's also mentioned that she paints about the atrocities that that the Indian subcontinent is a witness to every day with regards to Dalits and the lower castes of this country. She has painted a lot about Dalit atrocities. Coming to today's painting, she's pained by the hate and the aftermath of Yashka demanding credit to her work. And so she paints about it in the Madhubani art form. And her second painting depicts a grandmother. She's a Dalit woman. What she tried to say is that even generations before, Dalit women have had to face the repercussions of Dalit men in the society and standing up. Even after generations, even now, although there have been spatial changes and circumstantial changes, societal changes, but what a Dalit woman goes through has remained the same. The situation of a Dalit woman, what happens to her when she stands up, has remained the same even after generations. So that's what she tried to depict in both these pictures today with regards to the panel.
Thank you so much, Niharika. We have Ravli Madari, a singer who wrote and will be singing a song on Rohit Vemula, about whom we heard even from Yashika's speech, and he will give the context of the song himself. Ravli, you there?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Hi. Hello everyone, Jai Bhim. I actually thank you for giving this opportunity, and appreciate the organizers who worked for this webinar, because in these times of hate mongering, I see it as a call to all of us that it is not simply enough to just exist, but exist loudly, vibrantly, and more powerfully. And I think we have to stay united in the struggle and fight towards social justice in all the platforms. And also, I take this opportunity to remember Rohit, his power and brilliance through this song. And this song is written by Devaya, not me, one of our beloved friends, Dalit friends. The context of the song is about the then cabinet minister Bandaru Dattatreya and Smriti Irani, how they have led to the institutional murder along with the Apparao, institutional murder of Rohit. And it also has few lines about us remembering being with Rohit in mess, eating food with him, hanging around in Shopcom, the area where students in the campus usually hang around during evenings for chit chat and all. So the song goes like this. చీకట్లో వెన్నెలవై వెలిగిపోతావా వేముల రోహితు, దారి చూపుతావా వేముల రోహితు, చీకట్లో వెన్నెలవై వెలిగిపోతావా వేముల రోహితు, దారి చూపుతావుల రోహితు, బండారు దత్తాత్రేయ వామన రూపం ఇదిరా, మనుషులను బలి చేసేటి బీజేపీ వాదముల బలి చక్రవర్తిలాగా బలి అయినావా వేముల రోహితు, మోసపోయినావా వేముల రోహితు, చీకట్లో వెన్నెలవై వెలిగిపోతావా వేముల రోహితు, దారి చూపుతావా వేముల రోహితు. మనుస్మృతి రానిది ఆ జన్మనుకుంటే, మనుస్మృతి మనకుంటే మనపై సవతి తల్లి ప్రేమ చూపే మనుస్మృతి రాని నీకు పురిటి నొప్పులు తెలుసా మనుస్మృతి రాని చీకట్లో వెన్నెలవై వెలిగిపోతావా వేములా రోహితు దారి చూపుతావా వేములా రోహితు కాషాయం రంగు నిన్ను కర్కశంగా చంపే నీలి రంగు ఉండొద్దని నీళ్లు జల్లబట్టే కాషాయం రంగు నిన్ను కర్కశంగా చంపే నీలి రంగు ఉండొద్దని నీళ్లు జల్లబట్టే ఆ నీలి రంగు నీళ్ళల్లో నా బోధే వృక్షమయ్యే వేములా రోహితు నీడనిస్తావా వేములా రోహితు నీలి రంగు నీళ్ళల్లో నా బోధి వృక్షమయ్యే వేములా రోహితు నీడనిస్తావా వేములా రోహితు చీకట్లో వెన్నెలవై వెలిగిపోతావా వేములా రోహితు నీడనిస్తావా వేములా రోహితు మెస్సుల్లో మాతో కలిసి బూవా తింటున్నట్టు మెస్సుల్లో మాతో కలిసి బూవా తింటున్నట్టు షాపు కోములోన నువ్వు ఛాయే దాగినట్టు షాపు కాములోన నువ్వు స్తూపమైనవా వేములా రోహితు తిరిగిరారా బిడ్డ వేములా రోహితు షాపు కాములోన నువ్వు స్తూపమైనవా వేములా రోహితు తిరిగిరారా బిడ్డ వేములా రోహితు చీకట్లో వెన్నెలవై వెలిగిపోతావా వేములా రోహితు దారి చూపుతావా వేములా రోహితు చీకట్లో వెన్నెలవై వెలిగిపోతావా వేములా రోహితు దారి చూపుతావా వేములా రోహితు జోహార్ రోహిత్ వేములా. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. It was such a beautiful song, and you sang it so beautifully. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Now I would like to invite Cheshta Rajora, a student at University of Hyderabad, to recite a poem.
Am I audible to you, Rupali?
Yes.
I think I'm audible to everyone also. So first of all, thank you so much, Rupali, for having me here, and very good evening to all the panelists. I'm so thankful for everyone, to everyone for organizing this very timely discussion on such a pertinent topic of the global stage. I'll first of all share the screen of my text so that everybody can follow as I read it. Rupali, can you please tell me if it's visible?
You started sharing the screen, but yeah, now it's visible. Thank you.
So before I begin my reading of the poem, just a small brief as to what propelled me to write it, which was of course the incident that occurred concerning the Dalit author Yashika Dutt. And it really unnerved me and unsettled me, and it led me to think about other interconnected things in history and in contemporary times. And it led me to think about freedom and unfreedom, and how certain figures go on to become universal symbols of that journey and that walk from unfreedom to freedom. And hence the title of the poem is rather for Yashika Dutt, which is an attempt from one Dalit writer to talk directly to another Dalit writer through a creative and literary form, rather than the zeitgeist tweaks as our culture likes to take to. So for Yashika Dutt, when you decided to march the streets of that promised land of liberation, despite what Allen Ginsberg said, what does he know about the desire to belong somewhere, about the madness that last not resort? instead of the effort of remembering to please them, instead of the effort of forgetting to please them. Suspended so between memory and its forgetting, which is your own thinking, often by blood, often by nature, almost always by history, and always by destiny. As you take this solitary walk, a walk that makes this restless earth fall, turn inside out, remember its sins, its undoing, in the soft eternal light. For what dies is not the light, but the possibility to see it. Like Buddha, who led the people to the golden meditative silence. Like Plato, who led the people to truth and its flickering shadows. Like Moses, who led the people from Egypt to Palestine. Like Ashoka, who led the people to non-violence beyond the ruins of Kalinga. Like Jyotiba, like Savitri, who led the people to the word. Like Baba Sahib's Mahar, like King Junior's Selma, like Jina Amini's walk. As the free winds kissed her unfree hair. But nothing like Gandhi's spectacular walk to the Celtic Sea. No. But what did he know about the resolve of a woman who walks alone, who carries to the foreign land, not clothes to cover her untouchable body? So nothing can hide this untouchability even on this land, but a question that Rohit Vanilla whispered to us before he took his final walk from Velivada to the starry no man's land. A question he could not answer, nor wait for time and history to answer. A question that leaked like a tired, forsaken, pregnant belly and blooded all your belongings, still waiting for its deliverance. The question of the value of land. I know you're asking it, just as I'm asking it, as I'm also asking this. Did you find its answer on these glistening streets of this foreign land? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cheshta. Such a powerful poem. So we move into the Q&A session of the panel now. But before that, the pregnant me forgot to. I'm 8 months pregnant right now, and I forgot to put the lyrics that we got translated in English. That Niharika, who's helping us with the translation, she translated them, and I did not share them with you all. I'm so sorry about that. It completely slipped out of my mind, but I will do that in some time as one of the panelists responds. So all the insights from the speakers have been really great, and they have raised some of the important questions. I would like to throw those points to. Oh my God. I would like to throw those points to in the discussion itself. Like, what would Professor Appadurai would make of Emre's conceptualization around remediation? Because you also spoke about the requirement of social support for Dalits and for Dalit writers. So how do we initiate that?
Well, thank you for asking me that question as an entry into this general discussion. My head is whirling with the richness of the testimonies and expressions and representations that we've just heard, as well as all the contributions of the panelists and Yashika's own extraordinary graphic description of her experience and of what she sees that experience demands and compels and permits, all of those things. So my head is a little bit in turmoil, but let me speak anyway to the remediation question, though it's one of so many that's come up. But I think it's an important one because it has to do with, Netflix, streaming, the milieu surrounding that. And I've been reading for my own reasons quite a lot about how the global Netflix operation works, how it sources the stories, how it looks for stories in location A, which may work in location B, completely separate globally. So there's a kind of, talking of global, there's a kind of global search to grab stories and plots and narratives. And my colleagues here who are more involved with literary studies, including you, Rupali, can do much better than I can. And what is guiding the story, my story, that story, but story itself has become a business category. And I think we need to pause over that. But remediation is something I've been interested for a long time, because I grew up in Bombay, where anywhere I went, to a cricket match, to a movie, to a political speech, all the other contexts were whirling around in my head and was scripting how I received any particular context. So early on, I realized that we are in a extraordinarily plural. This is going back to 70s, 80s, 90s, before the digital era. We were already in what I once used the term cross mediation. That is to say, where going to a museum informs your idea of cricket match, which then informs your idea of the movie, which then informs everything else. And nobody has a very good, so far as I know, in all humility, in media studies or even in literary theory, this kind of some grasp on this phenomenon. Yes, there is some little bits of Bakhtin and this and that, but to me, they don't really catch this milieu. But I think I'll just say one thing about it. One, that it is truly very important in a place like India, that there are things like, let's say, Madhubani painting, old, deep, but which now circulate through all this kind of cross mediation. And everybody lives in that world, everybody, without exception. And I mean the poorest of the poor as well are in that medium. But something has happened, and this may go to things that both Bill and Martin have referred to, which is somehow more general, which is a capture of the circulatory space by certain kinds of exclusionary and indeed violent interests. So it's not just a matter, in the old days, as we would say with Marx, there's some exploitation. Well, that's always been true. But there's something where these days there is a surplus, and I'll stop with this intervention, this comment, that I've always been interested in, that out of any 100% of domination, what is that 2% which is excessive? When you cut off somebody's hand, or you cut off do something which is needless. You want to eliminate them, kill them if you have to. But what's that extra, that surplus? And I think somehow what's going on in our current moment of cross mediation is a systematic effort to sort of monopolize that 2% surplus. Not just to exploit, control, dominate, that's always there, but that there's some extra business being done, and I'm not sure how to understand it. And I'm sure that Yashika's experience and the general story of large excluded groups will inform us more about this. But I think something new is going on in that needless extra. In other words, I would ask Yashika this, if I may. I mean, why attack you so viciously? Why not just ignore you, marginalize you, treat you as if you're just a nobody? I mean, people know how to do that in this universe, in Bollywood. But now, no, they have to go the extra mile. So that extra mile to me requires contemplation. And this Yashika story and the Dalit story are an invitation to asking, what is the need for that extra bit of humiliation, silencing, abusing, and marginalizing, on top of what is already there? I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Professor Appadurai. I would like to take in a question from from the audience, which is around conundrum that Professor Puchner talked about. It is by Solomon Donald, and they're asking a question about accessibility to Dalit literature. They say that they only see a few writers being published in the English Dalit literary realm. Is it because we are yet to discover new voices, or because they are yet to come out? Or is it because simply between the gap between the vernacular and English literary worlds? And their associated question is about affordability of this English writing being accessible to the contemporary Dalit youth. They are asking whether this stops them from exploring or learning about the challenges the community faces. Professor Puchner?
Oh, you wanted me to?
Yeah.
Well,
Sorry.
I think in some ways, Yashika's own personal experience navigating the publishing world, I think, would speak more directly to it. I mean, I can just say a few general remarks, which is that, you know, it's unbelievably hard to get translated into English. The English publishing market is controlled by 5 international conglomerates, and only about 2% of books published in America are translated literature. And so in some sense, this New York publishing market is an unbelievably provincial, and it's unbelievably hard to get writers who don't write in English translated into English, and that's true across the board. And so there are a few very small niche writers, and sometimes university presses pick up some of that slack. I'm associated with a website, Words Without Borders, that tries to publish, and they have a great track record, and that their translations are available for free. So there are a few very small, not-for-profit places that try to do what they can, but it's very hard. But I know much, you know, I know that. And that's also part of the global, what Professor Appadurai described as the, you know, the extractive nature of the streaming services is, you know, is of course also true of the publishing industry. But you know, I would also like to bounce this back to Jessica, and because of course all these conglomerates have their offices in India and a few other places, and so I don't have, you know, obviously personal experience. So I would love to hear that, actually, that story.
Yashika, would you like to answer?
Yeah, I'd like to actually answer both questions, and thank you for raising them. I think the question really talks about, you know, accessibility and why don't we hear Dalit writing in English? It's because we have a history of Dalit people being kept away from education. And I think we're still dealing with the effects of that history about what it means when Dalits are kept away from institutional access into, you know, spaces of academia. And there are very few of us who have been able to break into these spaces. So, you know, that is why you're seeing very few literary voices coming out of India in English, because, you know, the Rohit Vemila's last letter talks about why Dalit writing has such a complicated history with the language of English. Because for us, the language is a way to speak to a dominant caste establishment in their own words, but also in a global language that they defer to. So that sort of creates a power dynamic that shifts things a little bit in our favor when they don't exist. So which is why more and more of us are trying to enter into this English writing space, because we know that captures a global audience. And my hope is that my book, you know, it's not just me. There is Yogesh Maitreya, who's written his incredible memoir in English that has just been published. I would encourage anybody who's listening and interested in Dalit English writing to pick that book up. And there are so many other books that are now lined up to be released. So this is the start. It took me a very long time to get here. And I think once the barriers open a little bit, creates more of an entry point. And I think the other question is also accessibility and whether Dalit youth will find it challenging to afford it. The book is, at least in India, is fairly accessible. I've heard how there are pirated copies available on traffic signals, and I've seen PDFs circulating online. And I think it's really important for people to access this work just outside of the mode of profit making. While I do want to be acknowledged and paid for what is my work, but I also understand that it is important for people to access this work even in ways, even if when they can't afford it. So I think that's one. And I want to also answer Professor Appudurai's question about why attack so viciously and why not just ignore. And I think the answer to that is because of the rising power of Dalit voices and narratives that has been recognized by not just the global establishment, but even in establishments in India. Now, I think because of the movements that have come from India, whether this is, the current legislation in California or in academia, where, Dalit studies, as you mentioned, is becoming this formidable force, it's really hard to say caste doesn't exist or we can ignore caste anymore. So what you can't ignore, you must humiliate, you must erase. And I think, like I mentioned in my little talk, that the reason the pushback was so vicious is because there is a precedent that is set in Indian, sort of South Asian spaces, about teaching a brutal lesson to a Dalit person who falls out of their caste order. And like what you rightly said, we are considered property. So how can property stand up and ask for their own copyright? And that really is at the root of this backlash that I experience, whether it is from Bollywood or from other Dalit folks, about, how dare she? How dare she? We let her write this book. And that's how I experienced this. We let her write this book. We let her be where she is. And now she asks us for credit. She should be grateful that she's depicted in that series without a permission, without her, without even asking. So I think it's more of that casteist backlash that Dalit women often experience when they demand anything as their own.
Thank you so much, Yashika. A question to Professor Deresiewicz. Emrys raised some question on who owns the principle of coming out, of the coming out story, the concept of coming out. What do you think are the moral and legal aspects of this question?
If I could just quickly respond to the previous question, because one aspect of the question that I didn't hear addressed by the respondents was the vexed one of English writing not being accessible to Dalits who don't have English, and this historical analogy may be of limited use, but I think of the case of Isaac Bashevis Singer, the great Yiddish writer, comes to the United States. He becomes accessible to an English audience and eventually wins the Nobel Prize because Jewish writers in the United States, Saul Bellow among others, translated his writing, began the process of translating his writing into English. And he wrote for many, many years here, but he continued to write in Yiddish and be translated into English by Jewish American writers who had greater access to the publishing industry. So he was still addressing Yiddish audience, but he was able to address the global English-speaking audience. And I look forward, perhaps, to the time when that would be possible for Dalit writers, even writing in vernacular, when, like Yashika, there are Dalit writers who hopefully have more ready access to the English market, kind of pulling them along. As for the question I was asked, I'm not sure my answer is different from the one I gave about stories in general. Who owns the coming of age story? You know, really, I mean, the coming out story. you know, I think it's again the person owns their own story, and I think that it's a matter of combating these older or other or also very self-interested ideas about, you know, who gets to own a story that comes from a community. I mean, I guess there's an analogy there, right? Because you're coming out. You know, what does that phrase mean? You know, I'm revealing the fact, but you're also coming out of the community, right? You're bringing your story with you, and the community that you come from wants to lay claim to it, and the global publishing or Netflix industry, streaming industry, wants to own it too, in a different sense, and maybe giving equally specious justifications for their right to own it, whether it's like, you should be grateful. I mean, this idea that you should be grateful that we're using your story at all. I mean, this is also kind of the line that's fed to any you know, musician, artist, whatever. It's like, you're getting visibility. Why do you expect to be paid? We're paying you in the currency of visibility. Of course, you know, you can't eat visibility. So, I mean, they're really sort of tremendous economic forces that have mobilized ideological forces to create this belief that's also very convenient for the audience, that I mean, people will literally say artists do not deserve to get paid for their work. And if it's convenient for the audience, because the audience doesn't want to pay either. So that, you know, that needs to be constantly foregrounded. This insistence that, you know, this is on ownership without apology.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deresiewicz. I would like to ask Professor Puchner actually this question, which is asked to Yashika, but I would, because Dr. Deresiewicz also writes about some element of his personal life in his book, and so does Professor Puchner. So why, I mean, the question is a little bit direct to Yashika, that why she prefers memoir and also memoir over autofiction, but why does writing about self become important? But how do we, because there is a lot of Dalit autobiography in India, in vernacular languages, as well as a few in Dalit in English language. So how do we move beyond autobiography once we write it down? And what is the importance of writing down that element of you in that form? How does it, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a literature person, but it feels that in the process of writing autobiography, Dalits keep writing one after second autobiography, and the emphasis is more on Dalit autobiographies compared to the US, where a person writes one autobiography, but they also weave some another story, some another element to those autobiographies. For example, Professor Puchner, when he writes about Rothwelsch, he writes about words, he writes about the history of words, the history of Rothwelsch. So how does it operate?
You wanted me to answer?
Yeah, yes.
Rupali. Well, so, I mean, it's interesting how autobiography is valued or it sort of becomes a default in certain contexts and not in others. So in Germany, where I grew up, there's much less autobiographical writing than in the US. And so for myself, I had always made fun of the prevalence of autobiographical writing in the US my whole life. And then sort of for my sins, kicking and screaming, I was sort of dragged into that space myself in the context of this project, of this, you know, secret language, thieves language, and underground language that my family was connected to in a complicated way and that I had known growing up. And it's something that was always in the back of my mind, and I thought I would write about it, but more academically. And whenever I tried to do that, I realized, no, that family story, that family and complicated family entanglement has to be part of it. And so finally, I wrote a kind of form where I interweave the family story with especially my grandfather and uncle, and just a tiny little bit myself. It's mostly my grandfather and uncle, with a history of that world, underground world, and then the Nazi Germany attacks on it, and so on and so forth. And I use sort of as a model books like The Hare with Amber Eyes, and there are many examples that I think do a great job in interweaving a personal story with a larger research or historical story. So that was my own personal path to it, but it was not a coming out story, really. It's more like reckoning with a history of silence and so on and so forth of that particular family history. But for me, as I said, it was not a default. It was more like something I wanted to avoid. And then I felt like that was the form in which it needed to be. So I first tried everything else and then realized that's what it had to be. And it would be interesting to hear Yashika talk about it, where that, the coming out story is a personal story from the beginning. So whether there was a similar struggle, I suppose.
I'd be happy to sort of build up on that and also go back to Merve Emre's question about, coming out and who owns the coming out story? What part of the story can be owned? Is it the phrase, the character, the ownership? Is it a copyright, a legal right, a moral right? Right. So I think I would, the best way I can explain it is how I perceived this idea. So co-panelists might or might not know, I was within this pushback and violence that I experienced, I was also forced to out myself as a queer person, which would be unthinkable in, I live in the United States, and the fact that anybody in 2023 is forcefully outing somebody or forcing them to out themselves as queer is really violent and dangerous. So I've always been a queer person. It's just I never thought I had the permission to talk about one more identity as a Dalit woman, as a woman, as a marginalized person from a geographical location that doesn't have the positionality within the larger Dalit movement. I never felt that I had access to that another marginalized space, or I did not feel that I had the bandwidth to take on that yet another form of visible marginalization, and therefore I never talked about it. But I always have been queer. And for me, when I was thinking about my own caste and this powerful experience of passing, Merve Emre also talked about what does passing look like for us. And for me in particular, passing looked like adopting Brahminical customs and changing our last name. We eat pork at home, but there was so much shame around eating pig meat because only Dalits or Muslims in popular imagination consume that. So, anytime that pork was cooked at home, there was a sense of shame around that. Don't tell your friends, close the doors and windows, don't let the smell waft out to the neighbors. So I think shame is a very powerful dimension of the passing, at least as far as I see it. And shame is also a tool that is used to keep Dalits in check, that is used to, Dr. Ambedkar describes castes as a prison of the mind. And that is, so shame is used as a tool to keep Dalits imprisoned in this idea, in this artificial idea of caste. And the fact that we think of ourselves as inferior because we are breathing this cultural milieu that tells us we're inferior. We grow up feeling inferior, so we believe that about that narrative, that story about ourselves. And when I moved to the United States, for a very brief moment, I was able to get respite from that constant questioning of hiding my identity. I talk about the toll that it took on me to hide my caste, all the performance that I had to create around not being Dalit, because that is all I knew. The fact that I inherently assumed that others who were not Dalit were superior than me, and therefore I was supposed to emulate them. And when I moved to the United States, which certainly has its own issues with caste, but not outside of South Asian communities, I began thinking about, why have we never talked about this? Why is there no collective reckoning with this secret that is so openly practiced in Indian communities within the South Asian subcontinent? Where is the literature? Where is the journalism? Where is the television show or pop culture reference where I could see that people hide their caste? Now, of course, that those references have existed in vernacular literature. Baburao Bagul is a powerful Marathi author who's talked about hiding his caste. Valmiki, Om Prakash Valmiki in Jhutan has talked about his experiences. Ambedkar hid his caste, but those are not accessible narratives. So when I moved here, I just, as a journalist, as somebody who just come out of journalism school, I was thinking of articulating in a way that makes sense for myself and for other people. We needed, being a journalist all my life, I knew that we needed something to identify this collective experience that is shared, but also secret, that is also erased. And for me, being queer and hiding my queer identity, and I moved here in 2014. 2015 was when gay marriage was legalized by the Supreme Court. So queer narratives were very potent and powerful and visible. So it just made sense to me to equate the closet of caste with the closet of sexuality. It was not in terms of owning a narrative, because as far as coming out narratives, they've been around for more than a century. So there was no question that if I say coming out as Dalit, I own it. It's conceiving of a phrase and then you let it go. You let it circulate so everybody else can own a part of it too. And I'm sure that there have been other Dalit queer people who've thought of similar ideas. But what was particular, and what I do have a legal, moral, copyrighted claim over, is my own likeness, is my own history and my own particular experience of how I arrived at this phrase, my experiences of what I felt while thinking about my own closet of caste and the identity of passing. So, those specific experiences of being a Bhangi woman, of being a lower caste person from a manual scavenging community, and the particularity of that shame that is foisted on people from my community and my community alone, and others who belong to that specific subsection of the caste system, that was my experience. And I think in this whole conversation, that has sort of been lost, that we're not talking about a universal experience. We're talking about a specific, particular life story of a person who underwent a really powerful experience and then talked about it, not just once, but for 8 years, and wrote a book around it. So I think it's a complex, nuanced answer to the question of who owns the coming out narrative. Nobody. But what I do own is my own life's work. So.
I would like to actually something which is not possible in India becomes possible in unknown waters, unknown land, like the US. So, Professor Dr. Deresiewicz, you have convinced a good number of people that elite education dumps them. But here is a community, I think, which needs this education. Let it be our constitution writer, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, let it be Ashika Dutt, let it be me. It gave us possibilities which would not be possible otherwise. So what would be your message about it?
Thank you. I think partly my work on elite education was a little misunderstood in the sense that I never said or intended to say that the whole enterprise is completely worthless and these elite universities should be, dismantled. I was always specifically talking about the mechanisms that that existed in the United States and in other Western countries to bring students from affluent backgrounds to those institutions and who they were by the time they got there and all that stuff. the kinds of people they created out of members of the sort of Western upper middle class. There's absolutely no question that education, and including especially maybe elite education, is incredibly valuable for individuals and groups who have been marginalized. In giving them individual opportunities, in giving them access and connecting them to elites and audiences around the globe. I guess if I could maybe slightly connect what I have said about the perils of elite education with also some aspects of the sort of global pop culture streaming, blah, 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 is that the danger for both is a process of homogenization, a process of how do you retain your individual voice, your individual personhood, as you either go through an elite education system. And this is kind of the classic dilemma of the quote unquote scholarship boy, right? Who comes to an elite institution and feels like, you know, as Yashika was just saying in a different context, I need to be like the people who already have cultural capital in that context. And one of the big problems of the global streaming economy is that those narratives that, you know, a company like Netflix is scouring the globe to find tend to be also homogenized, right? To be made palatable and entertaining and comfortable, and to file down, to erase that irritable individual difference that is what makes art valuable. If I could just say one more thing really quickly, while Yashika was talking the last time, it occurred to me that the very act of creating art, of writing or any other kind of art, is itself an act of individuation. That very difficult struggle to move from speaking the generic language that we all speak, that we all grow up speaking, the language of cliches and received ideas and sort of prefabricated language, and finding a unique language, a unique voice. And it's really, I would even say, aside from copyright issues, that that's the real basis of the right of ownership, is that insofar as art and writing is valuable, it's valuable because you're not only speaking of your own experience, you have struggled to find a unique voice that's different from the generic voice. So.
Before I just want to point out something I think somebody pointed out, and it's really important to correct this, especially in India, as we are facing increasing Islamophobia. In my earlier comment, I mistakenly referred as Muslims consuming pork. I meant to say Muslims consume beef and are lynched for transporting beef. So my comment, please be taken in that context. And when I talk about my personal story of Dalits consuming pork and consuming beef, it is mainly about the history of Dalit food, and whether it's cooking with blood or whether it's cooking with other discarded portions of the animal, and how there is a sense of shame that is foisted upon us for our practices that often are born out of survival. So I just wanted to make that very, very clear. No disrespect intended. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yashika, for clearing that. My question would be, this is the very last question, and then we have more questions, but I don't think we have the time. But this is for Professor Appadurai. Why social realism? It is a question by Adas Akdas Aftab. Please forgive me if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. Can one of the panelists speak about why social realism has been preferred more in Dalit realism? Does this relate to the prevalence of the Dalit memoir or autobiography?
Maybe, Rupali, if you permit, I'll leave that question aside because it's a bit beyond my capacity, although I'm very interested in different kinds of realism, magical, social, and otherwise, to say that one answer I have is a little bit like science fiction, that India is so full of extraordinarily unbelievable monstrosities that, just plain realism often does the job. We don't need that extra step, but that's only a comical comment. More serious literary scholars will have more to say. But I did want to say one thing pertaining to a lot of the discussion in the last 15 or 20 minutes. And this comes from my perspective as a scholar of India, who's been trying to think about India for my whole adult life. And that very recently, again, as I said earlier, by being exposed to the whole question of the Dalit, what light the Dalit experience sheds on bigger things, even beyond itself, though it's a remarkable challenge in its own right. And by learning from the work of other Dalit scholars, including my colleague whom I've never met, but I read very closely, Professor Thirumal from the media department of Hyderabad, who has done absolutely amazing work on higher education institutions, the kind of sensory world that prohibits the Dalit presence, the kind of literally the corporeal horror of having Dalit students in IITs. So I bring Professor Thirumal's work, first of all, to the attention of anybody in the audience who doesn't know it. It's a remarkable corpus of work, and I've learned a lot from it, but also others who've been writing on touch and Gopal Guru and other fine work. But the thing is, it led me to, as an anthropologist, which means from morning to night, our historical obligation is to think about caste. So we think about it in very limited ways, but it's what we have to do. Every morning and every night, we have to think about caste 25 times throughout my career, but rarely with new ideas. And the one idea I've had in recent times is that the crucial need in the kind of Indic civilizational order, both to have Dalits and to abuse and humiliate them. It goes to the questions that Yashika also you were responding to, is that the horror of involvement in the sensory world is actually a Brahmin horror for Brahmins themselves. And they managed to make it everybody's horror. That is, escaping from the sensory world. I've written something on this, and I won't bother to do the usual self-citation business I can share with anybody. Something recent about the haptic and the phatic and touch. And what I suddenly realized is Brahmins are constantly wondering how to get out of engagement with the sensory order. And that problem is then projected en masse to everybody below them, and especially to Dalits. So Dalits simply cannot be dispensed with, but they are the constant reminder of the Brahmin enmeshment with their own bodies, which is the final horror. Like in Conrad and Africa, the heart of Africa, the horror is internal, but it requires a vast population of 250 million to play it out on. So I'll just offer this small insight that has taken me decades to slowly crawl towards, that people in my social category are not just beneficiaries, dominants, exploiters, they're all that. Of course, we must add to that all the non-Brahmin upper castes, about which a story will have to be written someday. The upper Shudras, so to speak, all the way from Tamil Nadu to Kashmir, whose story is yet to be told. But still, that there is a problem, very fundamental problem. This is why, by the way, I'll throw this in as a little extra point. The whole caste race conversation, Wilkerson, etc., about which I've had some reservations, is not so helpful, because I don't think it's the case that whites as a class, as a status group, as a caste, whatever you want to say, have an internal problem with the world, which they then play out. They do see that their problem is different. Blacks are blacks, they're this, they're that, they're other. In India, what I'm saying is the top of the order sees the bottom as having its problem multiplied by 500. And that's different than any white ruling order of which I'm aware. So I throw in this comparative observation because it has implications for why should we read the literature? Why should it? Because it is not a footnote to slavery, this thing, that thing. We just then write a footnote at the end, Dalit cases like this. It's just not the way to go. Anyway, it's not the question you wanted me to answer, but there it is.
Thank you, Professor Appadurai. And if the panel allows me, I have only one last question to ask Professor Puchner, if he's willing. So it's about the recent attack on Yashika Dutt, and whenever Dalits they pose any content online which is anti-Brahminical, there is a threat that they will face repercussions. So how do you think that this new technologies have been democratic for Dalits and other marginalized section of the world now and historically?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll just speak very generally about it and don't want to take up a lot of time, but it's what I've learned from what I've heard here, and it's in some sense not surprising, is that social media is both has enabled, and I think, Yashika, you talked about your own journey in that way, to raise their voices because the barriers are much lower, right? That's the big change in the Gutenberg world. Everyone could be a reader. There was this virtuous cycle of literacy, but the barrier for being an author was very high because it was very hard to become published. That's why we have the category of the author. Not everyone is an author. Very few people can be authors. Almost everyone can be a reader. You have mass readership, very high barrier. And that's the big change to the internet, where everyone can be an author, where, to the extent that I even sometimes wonder whether the category of author will, in some sense, change, certainly, or maybe even go away, because if it applies to everyone, it really changes its meaning. So it just seems to follow a pattern where, social media, the internet, in doing away with the barrier of becoming an author as opposed to becoming a reader, is the place where the first conversations can become public, can be published. But it is also because it's this unregulated place, and we've all woken up to that, where the backlash happens. So that's the conundrum, or that's the difficulty of it, where that this is also an unregulated space. It's a space of anonymity. It's the space of trolls and all of that. So that, I think that's just and I don't know how to solve that, but it will be very difficult to figure out how to have the one without the other, because it is precisely the unregulated and uncontrolled nature, I think, that in part allows people to that led to the lowering of the hurdle of becoming an author. So that's how I would describe the media paradox, and I'm not the only one to point this out, but that's what it seems like to me.
I would like to thank you all the panelists for your generous time and for all the comments. I hope to take this discussion forward, and I will send the lyrics of the song in email. I'm so sorry I could not share it over here. And I would also like to thank Niharika, who has been taking notes for us for this panel. This panel will be recorded, and if anybody would like to share it, would like access to it, I would share it with them. And I would like to thank the Macmillan Center for giving us the space, and Dr. Gupta, who has been here throughout this session, helping us with a little bit with the background work. And thank you so much again, Professor Appadurai, Dr. Francisca Madandana, who could not join us, Professor Puchner, Dr. Deresiewicz, Yashika Dutt. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to all the audience.
Thank you, Rupali. I really appreciate it. I just want to thank everybody for being here in this space. I think it really elevates the level of conversation into a different realm. And I firmly believe that this conversation will have long-lasting impacts into the world of Dalit literature and culture as we move ahead. So thank you, Rupali, and thank you everybody for joining.
We hope so very much. Thank you, Yashika. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you. Bye.